Good morning. Um, it is great to be here with everyone. As we get started, maybe you can, would love to see where people are joining us from this morning. Well, I'm Dr. Sarah Brown, and I am our Senior Director of MTSS Solutions at Renaissance, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk about maximizing MTSS outcomes, and specifically how to make sure that we're getting the most growth from the systems of our within MTSS. Good morning, Patricia. I'm actually also in the Chicagoland area. So it's great to see you. See, people are joining. Good morning. Okay, and we are going to jump right in. Just so that we can best use your time this morning. And what we're finding, and I'm sure as we all know way too well, the needs of students are evolving right now. They are different from what we've seen even a few years ago. And many districts are looking to an MTSS to help them address those evolving needs. So put in quickly in the chat, what are words that you think of when you hear the term multi-tiered system of support? What comes to mind? I love seeing where everybody are from all around the country. It's early in Phoenix. Differentiation, prevention, love that. Behavior tiers as well. Data, interventions, monitoring. Individualization. Providing schools with support, paperwork. I appreciate that, Gina. The whole child. This is great. Yes. So those are absolutely the types of things that come to mind when we think of an MTSS. And because it wouldn't be an MTSS presentation if I didn't show you the pyramid, here it is. It's my legally required one for every presentation. But as a reminder, when we think about an MTSS, lots of people here mentioned Tier 1. I'm hearing Tier 1 come up more this year than I ever have. As we think about an MTSS, schools are definitely honed in on how to intensify Tier 1 supports for all students. As we look at the MTSS pyramid historically, what we've heard a lot of focus on more is around interventions and intervention systems. And so the Tier 1 are resources that we're providing for all students. Tiers 2 and Tier 3 are those additional resources that we're providing for some and a few students. And what we know is that there's an urgency right now to improve the quality of the classroom instruction that all students are receiving. We know that we can't intervene our way to success for all students, that we need to focus on this foundation of Tier 1. Most districts try to support about 80% of their students with only those Tier 1 resources. And it isn't an exact science, but we find that that when you can support more students with Tier 1, we have fewer students who need to access intervention resources, and that's where that 80% comes from. It actually comes from public health originally, but the idea is that when we have more students who need interventions, then we have intervention space to provide that, intervention resources to provide. That's when schools look to intensify or improve their Tier 1 supports and focus their MTSS work on Tier 1. And then when we look at Tiers 2 and Tier 3, those are resources that we're providing to some and a few students. Typically, these resources overall serve about 20% of students. It's just what districts have available in these types of resources. And these are designed to be supplemental in nature in addition to the Tier 1 resources that we're providing for all students. And they should be intensive enough to support students who need them to become proficient in reading, math, social emotional skills, whatever those P should be. And so we have fewer of these resources in Tiers 2 and Tier 3, but they're designed to support those students and give them extra when it's needed. You'll notice at the top of these last two slides that I have the tiers are resources, not students. And so when you see this pyramid, I encourage you to look at it as the resources that we have in our school, as opposed to the students in our school. And so I used to talk about that I had tier 1 kids, I had tier 2 kids, I had tier 3 kids in my school district. Really what we're talking about are the resources within our schools to support student needs, because as we know, all students receive tier 1 resources. Some students are also receiving those tier 2 and tier 3 resources. So students aren't tier 2 students are actually receiving resources from throughout the pyramid based upon their needs. So we are actually going to, as we think about MTSS, I'm very interested. We're hearing a variety of different needs around the country right now related to MTSS. So we're actually going to pop in a Nearpod. So you can join me at the site join.nearpod.com. And then we're going to enter in this code. And I'm going to flip over to Nearpod now. You'll see the code again. And you're going to see a question. I'm really interested to hear about what are your MTSS wins and challenges this year. And so as you type in, we're going to see each other's responses. If you can kind of title them with either a W for a win or a C for a challenge, that'll help. But let's go in, and you can still see at the top the code if you're not quite there yet, but you can type in and share your thoughts. What are your MTSS wins and challenges this year? Yes, the link is absolutely. It's join.nearpod.com. And then the code is TX83Z. And it looks like we have people here. I might refresh my Nearpod. Do you think that's a good idea, Lena? Yes, okay. Oh, it's a bit slow. Okay, we can go. Let's, why don't you share your, share wins and challenges in the chat. We can go to the chat too. We are flexible. That is the name of the game in education, especially right now. A win curriculum. That's great. Having materials that support educators to be able to teach scope and sequence, or teach those either for tier 1 or those targeted specific skills that students need to fill for skill gaps for intervention is really critical. We have more than the recommended number of students needing small group support. We're seeing that a lot. Lots of I'm seeing a lot related to science of reading a little bit, right? Like phonics groups, great phonics program. Way too many students. Appreciate that, Jamie. So matching student needs, I hear, with resources. Yeah, Laura, I appreciate that one too. So Laura's mentioning limited flexibility to really intensify the intervention that when students aren't making growth in tier 2, scheduling at the high school level. Yeah, these are well, that's great. More teachers engaged. So keep those coming. These are absolutely ones that I've heard this year too. And I know that these are the types of things that schools are dealing with. I appreciate this, and helps kind of as we're having this conversation to reflect on. So as you mentioned, I'm hearing similar things that you're mentioning across the field. So I hear that schools are seeing wider achievement gaps than they've seen in the past, and different types of achievement gaps and different types of needs. And so meeting those needs across grade levels, across subgroups can be challenging. The subgroups of even needs. I also hear that it's overwhelming for teachers to implement, and this came up in the chat too, to implement interventions and progress monitoring. There's so much to do, it can become overwhelming, especially as we think about the number of students who are needing supports right now. We also hear from leaders that they need support in measuring the effectiveness of their multi-tiered system of support, in improving equity within that multi-tiered system of support, and driving continuous improvement. And so they need help measuring, and then and being able to communicate their success with their board, with their community, and with other stakeholders. And then we also hear, somebody wrote paperwork earlier, just ways to more efficiently and effectively integrate data and manage MTSS logistics into the day-to-day school year are some of the things that we hear about. And with across these challenges and just the opportunities that we see, I hear districts saying that they really want to they need to maximize the results that they're getting from the work that they're doing with an MTSS. And so that's really what I want to focus on today, is maximizing by focusing specifically on the system in the multi-tiered system of support. And we're going to talk about that in two ways, for tier one and then also for intervention systems. And the system part can be really powerful because it's what empowers educators to efficiently replicate their practices and activities to improve student outcomes in a scalable and sustainable way. And so it includes both the instructional side of things and those instructional routines, but also the data routines. And so we'll touch a little bit on both of those. And we're going to start by exploring tier one and maximizing tier one supports and outcomes. So first kind of thing, which tier in the multi-tier system of support has the most resources available to it? A little bit leading, because we're talking about tier one, but it's tier one, right? We have the most resources within our tier one. Thanks, Gina, for participating. So these are some of our resources within tier one, and maximizing how they're allocated and used to support the needs of students in the building today can drive the MTSS focus, especially if you're finding you have more students who need interventions than you have interventions to provide. And so these types of resources are ones that can be intensified or modified to support student needs. So we can do things like target professional learning toward specific tier one evidence-based routines, or focus our instructional time through schedules that are smart to prioritize ways that we can team better as educators, or group students more efficiently and effectively to provide supports that they might need. So when we think about an MTSS, intervention systems themselves will be more successful if they're built on a really strong tier one foundation. So if, let's say, we were invited to do HGTV the renovation show, right? And we were all invited. There are 2 bathrooms that you're going to renovate, and you get to choose which of the bathrooms you want to renovate, right? And so one of them is a pretty newer home. It's just really needs some, it's got a great layout, but it needs some updating, right? Some new fixtures, that type of thing. And the other one has water damage, and we're not quite sure, it's an older home, right? Which one are you most interested in? Which one's going to be the easiest to renovate, right? Clearly the one that is the first one. And what we find is that in education, it's the same. When intervention systems are built upon really strong core systems, our educators become less overwhelmed, and those interventions themselves can be more successful. So the first step in in solidifying the tier 1 foundation is to be able to target our improvement efforts. We had all of that list of resources. We want to be able to target the improvement efforts that we provide based upon specific needs within tier 1. And so having data visualizations and tools that can allow us to make actionable insights and be able to target those improvements are really important. And so I'm going to highlight a couple different tools and then also share some ways that schools think about using their data and then going about improvement. And so specifically, EduClimber and Renaissance Analytics within, if you have STAR, are two of those data visualization tools that can help that. So typically when school districts are thinking about how effective and our tier 1 supports, they look at an overall percentage of students who are meeting targets on screening assessments or outcome measures. And so this is an example. If you have STAR, you have access to Renaissance Analytics. So this shows, it's designed for leaders to be able to review their data at an aggregated level and then also be able to drill into those pieces. So this is a highlight of just the overall proficiency rate on STAR reading. So you can see of the students who were assessed, 47% of them are meeting those. So in this case, there are a lot of students at risk in reading, right? So this can become overwhelming. We can see that we likely need to support our tier 1 efforts in order to meet all students' needs. And in these cases, it can often be beneficial to drill into these data and look at some additional data visualizations and ask a couple other questions too around tier 1. So this is pretty stark, right? We can see that we have tier 1 needs. And we also have other tools available to us. So this is my favorite visualization tool within EduClimber. So this is an EduClimber itself. This is called the effectiveness report. I call it the Chutes and Ladders report, which probably dates myself a little bit, but it reminds me of the Chutes and Ladders game that I used to play as a child. But if we want to answer the question, how effective are our tier 1 supports? We can do that by identifying what percentage of students who started the year on track grew enough to stay on track. And that's what this shows you. So if we're looking only at students who likely received just tier 1 supports. And so if I ask you what percentage of students, and this is different than the typical question that we ask in MTSS, so you might want to listen carefully. If I ask you what percentage of students who start the year on track do you expect to end the year on track? What would you say? So they started in the fall on track. What percentage of those students do you expect to end the year on track? I didn't ask you to put it in the chat. If anybody wants to, they can. Yeah, but yeah, Gina's like, is this a trick question? We expect all of them to, right? Like we expect that all of the students who start the year on track end the year on track. I appreciate them. So what we find is, yes, I'll please all of them, right? We don't necessarily always have the data though to be able to drill into that and have the answer to that, right? But that's obviously what we want. And so that's another way to look at it. And frankly, it's one way that in a school district, if you're in a school district, I'm guessing that you chose to come to an MTSS presentation. And so you might not think this, but there might be others in your district who think, you know what, like we aren't going to have, we'll never have 80% of our students who are meeting needs with just our tier 1 supports. And that looking at that kind of starting with this can be, if it's 47%, can be overwhelming, right? And daunting. Being able to drill in though and ask the question a different way and say, okay, what percentage of our students do we expect to end the year on track, who start on track, is a different question that sometimes people can, is a nice way to start. So within this report, basically what it's showing you is on the left-hand side, it's showing you the percent of students in each of the benchmark categories from screening in the fall. And then on the right, it's showing us winter in this case. You can pull up different screening periods depending on what you prefer in your school. And so what's showing you, that red line there, is showing us the percentage of students who started the year at low risk, who grew enough to be low risk at winter. So I can use these data and look to see across what does it look like, right? Other data visualization tools too, if you have other data visualization programs, they're likely, you might have these types of programs, like this type of report as well. And so I can look and see and see, so what that is. I can also then look to see, okay, which students started low risk and grew enough to actually be in the next benchmark level, right? If your universal screening tool has that. And I can look to see, like, the question that's probably in our minds, right? Like, did we have students who started the year on track who didn't grow enough to stay on track, right? They didn't actually regress, right? They just didn't grow enough. And what you might find, and what I found in school districts that I've worked with in the past, is that sometimes specific grade levels that have maybe more rigorous kind of growth expectations because of the standards that they have, you'll see differences across grade levels. But that gives you an opportunity then to drill in, right, and target for your tier 1 improvement efforts. And here's what we find. So one way a school district might use those data is to identify, okay, we're focusing on foundational literacy. A few people mentioned that in the chat, actually. And so we might be focusing on foundational literacy this year. And so I might look to see and find specific grade levels where we have fewer students who are growing enough. And we might be using coaching resources to support educators to use their tier 1 data to make decisions about skill needs and everyday actions that they can take with those data. We might do some targeted professional learning on some evidence-based routines for teaching specific phonics skills that teachers can use in a scalable way and repeatable way for different skills that they're teaching. And we may focus instructional coaching resources to specific grade levels where we see less success, to support educators to plan and implement practices that can help them. And so they may be using those instructional coaching resources to help teachers figure out how to get practice products in a regular way, or how to use some Nearpod lessons that are focused in to give students additional practice. And so ways to target those tier 1 resources to improve the outcomes for all when we see that we have fewer students who are staying on track than we expect. I also want to touch on, as we think about tier 1 before we leave a tier 1 conversation, a little bit on chronic absenteeism. Do we all have access? I didn't look ahead of time to see if everybody has access to reactions, but give me like a thumbs down, or if you are concerned about chronic absenteeism this year. Is that something that's on people's radar where you live? I know it's a concern in a lot of places. Yeah. Yes, it's a concern. Yeah, we're seeing this. I mean, clearly it's a high concern in a lot of places. According to Attendance Works, I don't know if people follow Attendance Works, but it's a place where I get a lot of my learning on chronic absenteeism. Yeah, other people have found it too. One of the evidence-based ways that they've identified to impact chronic absenteeism is to actually use your data. So using and monitoring absenteeism in a data, like, and having teams that are looking at those and ways that you're doing that on a regular basis is one of the ways that they focus. And that is absolutely a focus of the system in MTSS, right? So how do we systematize the use of our attendance data in order to be able to impact that and make a difference? So this is a feature. This is, again, within EduClimber. One way that you can use EduClimber is that it has the Students 3D feature, and I'm not going to go into the functionality of it, but one thing that we can do in order to track attendance data, right, is to look at what percentage of students have attendance that aren't at a 95% attendance rate, right? And so in this feature, I can use Students 3D to focus on attendance, and it will actually kind of look and resort. In this case, I pulled up my 8th grade students because maybe I want to look at it for 8th grade, and I can see where students fall in different attendance bands, right? And I can set those bands myself. These are just kind of what I set up automatically, and then I can drill into specific students. I can look at different pieces. I could break it out by subgroup or other pieces that I wanted to. But the idea is using data visualization to review your absenteeism can help in identifying what are some things we can do, right? And so then when we think about allocating our tier 1 resources to combating chronic absenteeism, a district data specialist might, on a regular basis, maybe on a monthly basis, be visualizing and summarizing data for building leaders, right, on their absenteeism, and having conversations with building leaders. Teachers might receive targeted professional learning on ways that they can, on the common causes of chronic absenteeism and how to promote attendance with their students, so ways to do that. Teachers may also learn ways to recognize and award good attendance, and the MTSS system might have some definitions for building-wide policies, right? For when we're looking at those things, how we're rewarding, what those look like. And building leaders may be able to arrange also some more personalized early outreach, right? Some of those evidence-based, what are the common practices that we're going to implement in tier 1 in order to support all students and improve our attendance rates over time. So in addition to maximizing, that was tier 1. In addition to maximizing and supporting tier 1 needs, we know that districts need to maximize their intervention outcomes too. And I know I don't believe I mentioned this at the beginning of our conversation, but we absolutely will have time for questions at the end and conversation. So if there's any conversation that you have, Alina is on here to help kind of gather some questions. So please feel free as we go through to add any questions that you have or any insights about tier 1, and we'll also open up for additional ones at the end. But we're going to flip now to maximizing intervention outcomes and thinking about the intervention system, just like we did the tier 1 system. We're going to flip this Nearpod discussion into the chat again. But interested in challenges with your intervention system this year. I know we already kind of talked about a little bit about, or what came up last time in the last question was around some scheduling came up, time came up which I assume can impact intervention systems. What are other challenges that you're experiencing this year related to your intervention systems? Yeah, and we're gonna stay here in the chat for this one, Alina, just to, since we had trouble with the other one. Time and people to, yeah. So the same things that we saw before, right? I have is the schedule intervention. When you see students 30 minutes twice a week, absolutely. Being pulled from tier 1, yes. So how do we make sure that we're not pulling from tier 1? Student to teacher ratio, resources. Yeah, time. So these are very consistent. Intervention programming is really resource intensive to implement. It's expensive to implement, frankly. So the time commitment to just train and implement interventions, as well as the scheduling challenges that you have mentioned. You'll notice that I included scheduling 3 times on this slide for that reason, right? Time and scheduling is really hard. And then we have to think about all the meetings that we have to do, right? To review data, to match individual students with our intervention programs, and then to intensify for students who aren't making expected progress. And so because of that, we really need our interventions to be highly successful, right? When we're using all of these resources to provide interventions, we're not doing it to just for the optics of it, right? We're doing it to impact student learning. And so we need these to be really successful as we go through. So the first way districts often evaluate the success of interventions is through considering individual student success, right? Somebody mentioned progress monitoring. At least one person mentioned progress monitoring when we were asking about the challenges facing this year. So we think about, and we often are structured to review individual progress monitoring graphs for students who are receiving intervention. And so we collect that intervention data and we look at those individual student graphs. But today we're going to focus on the system part of it. And so we're going to focus on when we look at the system, we can consider interventions as a whole, as opposed to only looking student by student. So this is an example of intervention data that can be seen within EduClimber. Again, other programs might also have some aggregated data like this. And so you might have a program that you're using that's different. But in this case, one thing that you can do as your system, with or without EduClimber, is to look at what percentage of students who are receiving this intervention are successful. And so if I have an intervention that I'm doing 30 minutes a day or 30 minutes twice a week, somebody wrote, right? What percentage of students in that overall group are on track to meet their goal? So one way you can do that is by having a system like EduClimber that summarizes that for you. You could also, instead of organizing your intervention meetings by individual student, you can organize them by intervention group. And so you can organize them by, so this is our third period reading intervention. And so kind of look at those all together and say, okay, we have 12 students in that group. Here are the percentage of students, or the number of the 12 who are on track to meet their goals. And so that would be another way to do it if you don't have a system that's doing it, and you just want to do it kind of in real time, right? Organize those meetings by the intervention group that you're doing. And then you'll get a sense of, okay, overall, how successful is this intervention? Is it doing what we need it to do? Because what we find is, if it's not working for a majority of students, then we shouldn't be intensifying student by student, right? Or asking those questions student by student. We can come in and say, oh, we need to intensify this whole intervention. Maybe instead of 2 days a week, we actually need to go to 4 or 5 days a week. And so here's, this is what we need to do, because it's not working for any of the students, and you don't have to learn about that student by student, right? So that's one piece. You can also see then how we were able to implement the intervention. And so there's implementation fidelity data that many districts are collecting. And so within EduClimber, you can also see for that intervention, okay, were students participating in the intervention? Because if you're not there to get it, right, we're probably not going to expect your skills to grow. But we can look at those data as a system, right, to help us target then, as we're looking to improve the outcomes from our intervention systems, what we might focus on. The other way you can think about that is through, again, the effectiveness report. So here you can tag individual students who received intervention and use, as in addition to your progress monitoring data, your screening data to identify how are students moving as they go through when they start the year to the winter, right? So if students were high risk or some risk in the fall, what percentage of students were able to grow, right? And was that consistent with specific interventions? So now we have the opportunity to intensify interventions that aren't as effective, or potentially expand the use of some interventions that are the most effective in our buildings. So as we think about then, we have data around which interventions are more and less successful. There are a few ways that you can think about intensifying using the system to intensify interventions. The first is to improve the instructional match. And I'll show you some ways to use screening data to group students with similar needs for interventions. We can also look to improve implementation, or that fidelity piece. So being able to monitor and then intervene and improve intervention fidelity. And we can increase dosage. And so making sure that teachers are able to complete, I always talk about a lesson a session. If we're able to complete a lesson a session, we're typically, if you're using an evidence-based program, expecting to see then, if students read the research that they were supposed to respond, you tend to see better response. So we're going to dig into each of those just a little bit. So first, we'll focus on improving the instructional match. So oftentimes what you'll find is that you have students with similar needs within a grade level, given your curriculum and what you're able to provide and how students come in. And so within either EduClimber or STAR or FastBridge, whatever you're using, you should have some reports that are able to show you here are where students are at after screening, and you can group students with similar needs. And so grouping students with similar score profiles or based on a variety of data. In EduClimber, you can look at multiple pieces of data side by side. So you might be able to bring in your attendance data in addition to, right, your reading and math screening data. And so you can see what that looks like and use your screening data to be able to group students with similar needs so that you can get a great first match for intervention. And then as we look at our intervention success data, you might consider improving intervention implementation. So I talk about, if you don't have Fidelity checks right now for your implementation, for your intervention, you are similar to the majority of schools. Most schools aren't collecting those types of data, and they're more challenging to collect, or it's just another kind of thing to do, right? If you're thinking about that you need to, what I would start is starting with interventions that have fewer than half of the students who are receiving them on track to meet their goals. So if you see that fewer than half of the students who are in the third period reading intervention are on track to meet their goals, then maybe that's an intervention that you start to collect Fidelity data for. And if you see that we're not able to do what we thought we were going to do, and that happens for lots of reasons, and very, very good ones, frankly, many times. That's okay. We also find that sometimes things aren't implemented as we expect, and we get great outcomes. And so it really depends on the students, the program and their needs. But what we find is that if you aren't seeing, the students aren't making adequate progress, and we're not doing what we were hoping to do, there are some things then that you can do to try to improve the implementation. So one is to make sure that the educator who's implementing feels really confident with the intervention procedures. Are they doing all of the pieces of the intervention? Sometimes they don't understand why specific pieces are really important. And so making sure that they can receive training as well as any coaching, having maybe an instructional coach or somebody who's used the intervention before, provide some modeling and for them, and answering questions, meeting with them regularly, providing regular check-ins to identify and remove implementation barriers. And so instead of, I was a special education director in a life, and we implemented a new intervention program for students with disabilities in our middle school for language arts. And I found, like, I was asking every month when I go check in with a teacher who was doing it, I was asking, how is it going? We had a coach from the curriculum company coming in and meeting with her, and she was saying, it's great, it's great, it's great. And I would just ask a very general question, how is it going? And it was great. We got to our winter screening period, and we didn't see the growth. Students didn't meet the standard growth percentiles that we would expect. And so then I went in and observed the instruction, and I found that we were way back on literally on like lesson 11 or 12, but it was the middle of the year. And so so at that point in time I asked, right? I was like, so why are we on lesson 11? I was able to ask a more specific question, and she was able to tell me, oh, we actually didn't use this program for a month in the fall because we did this other thing that we do every year. And it was something really logical that had been part of the practice over time, but I hadn't dug in deeply enough to know why we weren't getting the outcomes that we expected until I saw those winter data and those growth percentiles. And then we were able to go back to understanding, okay, what do we need to do now to try to intensify and make sure students are able to get caught up, right? And see better growth from fall to winter. And that was a result of being able to observe the intervention and practice. And then last, I mentioned increasing dosage. This is something, multiple people alluded to. You didn't use the word dosage in your challenges, but it was definitely there. Increasing dosage is not easy. it's very simple to talk about, but it is not absolute. It's very difficult to do at times. But what we find is that as we have more students who need intervention, that we provide intervention to, our intensity and effectiveness of our intervention decreases. We also find that we become, the system itself, educators, interventionists, become really overwhelmed, right? We become overwhelmed by that, which I also saw in the chat as well. And here's what that looks like in action. So let's say we are in a building that has pretty average results, frankly, if you look at NAEP. So I just took NAEP data and I said, okay, if I was in a 400 student elementary school or middle school, how many students would need intervention? And it was about, if it was a 400 student in, building, about 268 may need intervention. So now let's say that we are blessed with one fabulous reading interventionist in this school, only has to focus on reading. And if we look at a lot of what evidence says for a lot of programs, it's about, they recommend usually 5 to 7 students and 30 minutes a day in order to get through a lesson each of those sessions. So that interventionist, if they worked all day long, could do probably about 9 interventions, right, and see 54 students. Now let's say that we know we have, somebody wrote an upside down triangle or upside down pyramid. And so let's say that we doubled the group size and we got to we increased the group size to about 10 students. You can say double and get to 10. And you could double the number of groups, right? So we went to 15-minute interventions instead of 30, or we did something like Tuesdays, Thursdays, Mondays, Wednesdays. And we were able to get to 180 students, right? So we have an interventionist who only has to focus on reading, which is a gift. And we're kind of maximizing what this one person can do, right? And we can see that he can serve about 180 students. So still we didn't get to everybody that we need served, right? Which kind of goes back to that tier 1 need. But we're trying to serve more students is the goal. This is what happens then to student outcomes in those cases. I had, like, the more students we serve, the less effective our interventions tend to be. This is what we're seeing, and I'm going to pull it out. You can assume this is actually just, I had on my bookcase in my house, Teach Your Child to Read in 100 Easy Lessons. And so, but the idea is you could take any program that you're using, right? And look to see if I can get through 5 lessons a week. What are students able to do? And this is after 10 weeks versus if we're able to get through only 3 lessons a week. What are students able to do after 10 weeks? And there is a stark difference in student skills, right? It's because as we serve more students, the intensity of our interventions decrease. And so then we don't see the level of outcomes that we're really hoping for from our MTSS. So it takes us back to, right, a couple of things. One is why we need the strong tier 1 foundation. But the second is, what are ways then that we can increase the dosage of our interventions so that we can get to closer to 5 lessons a week from 3 lessons a week? And there are a few ways that districts do this. So one is to try to increase the frequency of the lessons, or to increase the length of time. Clearly, that's challenging. People mention that, and it's not easy to do, right? It comes back to scheduling, and it comes back to staffing in many cases. Another thing you can do is try to build in additional ways for students to practice the skills that they're learning through intervention at other times of the day. And so practice products are one way to do that. They can also, if you have evidence-based routines that are quick, that you can have students be practicing on at different times during maybe some independent work time or other times of the day, we see that. Another way to increase dosage is to progress monitor students at times other than intervention time. So if you are in a building where you spend 1 day a week instead of intervention, you monitor student progress, or 1 day every other week, you can be losing up to 10 or 20% of intervention time, of instructional time, to progress monitoring. And so what I've seen districts do is things like have one student stay after each of the intervention periods and doing the 1 minute reading progress monitoring assessment and kind of student by student, each student has a different day of the week, or having other times during the day when students are progress monitored, as opposed to taking that intervention time for progress monitoring. So those are a few ideas of ways people have increased dosage. I know it's not easy to do, but it is something that has a big impact on student outcomes. And so 3 ways that we can intensify interventions when we see that they're not having the outcomes that we hope. And coming back to, right, like thinking about a really powerful way to increase outcomes within an MTSS is through maximizing the system. So just want to revisit that idea. As we do that, we can really harness the power of evidence-based practices to scale our results, to sustain our results, and hopefully to then multiply, right, student outcomes. So really maximize student outcomes moving forward. And I am going to stop talking for a moment and see what questions we have.
Sarah, we have one in the chat that says, when students take STAR reading or math assessment, do you have an integrated program to help students according to students' results?
Great question. So there are different ways that folks use STAR reading and STAR math to then group students for results. So absolutely, you can see within STAR reading, you can group students based on common skill needs, based on mastery, and so you can group students based on common needs within the program. You also have, right within STAR, the ability to link directly to Nearpod lessons. And so you'll also see connections to specific Nearpod lessons. If you want to help, if you want to kind of help direct and have additional practice on specific skills. And so that would be one way that you can use STAR. We see more often districts are using STAR to group students than they are kind of linking to a very specific then intervention. But you can absolutely locally be mapping and saying, okay, for students who have these skill needs within STAR, here's how that maps to our local interventions.
Awesome, thank you. We have another question. In one of the first image slide, you showed percent proficient in district, excuse me, was that on EC or Renaissance? Either way, I guess EduClimber. Either way, how do you access that data?
Yes, so so that was within STAR. So that was the Renaissance Analytics, I believe, is what we were is what you're speaking to. I'm looking, I believe it was this one. Yep. So you can get to that right through STAR, the Renaissance Analytics page. I don't have it pulled up right now. Do we have a link that we can post, like a help article to, Alina? We can get you a help article on that to show you how to get directly to Renaissance Analytics from STAR.
Then we've got best ways to use STAR reading and STAR early literacy data to give us information for school improvement.
Yeah, so I think STAR Renaissance Analytics is going to be a great place to start. You can look at those proficiency rates and then drill in. So I would start to look at things like buildings and grade levels where you have students meeting growth. If you're looking kind of at this time of year, look at your fall to winter data and look to see where do we have the most growth by student growth percentile and where do we have the least growth, and then target those tier 1 resources specifically to grade levels where you have less growth and that you need to, from winter to spring now, the time we have left this school year, be able to really ramp up growth that we're seeing. That's how I would start right now.
Perfect. I think that's it. And we will be sending the recording along with resources and all the different things you guys have asked. So please look out for that via email. Where do you find EduClimber? I've put a couple links in the chat, but I'll link it in here again. you want to get information on EduClimber. And let me just grab that really quick. EduClimber, where are you? Here we go.
And thank you all. I know that it is a busy time of year and appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you joining us. Thank you, Sarah. And we hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.